Hey there, fellow travelers of Middle-earth. There's something about finding a sword in a troll horde that most people gloss over. We all remember that moment in The Hobbit when Thorin, Gandalf, and Bilbo stumble into that cave seeking shelter from the rain, only to discover it's actually a troll's lair filled with stolen goods. Among the plunder, they find these ancient elven blades. Thorin takes Orcrist, Bilbo gets what will become Sting, and Gandalf claims Glamdring. But here's what gets me every single time I read that passage. Gandalf doesn't just pick up some random sword. He picks up Glamdring, the foe hammer, and when Elrond later identifies it in Rivendell, tells them it belonged to the king of Gondolin, not just any elven lord, but the king, Turgon himself. Now think about what that actually means for a second. Turgon wasn't some minor character in the grand tapestry of Middle-earth's history. This was one of the mightiest Noldorin kings who ever lived, son of Fingolfin, who built the hidden city of Gondolin that stood as a beacon of hope against Morgoth for centuries. When you read the Silmarillion, you realize that Gondolin wasn't just another elven city. It was the last great stronghold of the Noldor and Beleriand, hidden so well that even Morgoth with all his power couldn't find it for hundreds of years. And Turgon ruled there, wielding Glamdring against the forces of darkness in the First Age. That's not 600 years before The Hobbit or even 1,000. We're talking over 6,500 years of history. The thing that strikes me most is how Gandalf, this seemingly humble wanderer in gray robes, ends up carrying the personal weapon of one of the greatest elven kings. There's something deeply intentional about this in Tolkien's writing. Gandalf isn't really just an old man, right? He's Olorien, one of the Mire, sent to Middle-earth by the Valar themselves, Hizo operating under severe restrictions, forbidden from matching Sauron's power directly, forced to work through inspiration and counsel, rather than raw force. And here he is, wielding the sword of a king who also chose a form of restraint. Turgon, hiding in Gondolin rather than marching out to open war. Both of them, beings of immense capability, choosing to limit themselves for a greater strategic purpose. When you look at Turgon's story in the Silmarillion, you see this king who could have been out there fighting alongside his brothers and cousins, leading armies across Beleriand. But instead, he followed Ulmo's guidance and built Gondolin as a secret stronghold, a place where elven civilization could be preserved even as the rest of Beleriand burned. He knew that sometimes the best way to fight evil isn't through direct confrontation, but through patience and preparation. Gandalf understood this too. He spent literally thousands of years in Middle-earth, watching, guiding, never revealing his true nature. So when he picks up Glamdring, it's not random. It's almost like the sword found its way to someone who understood what Turgon understood, that fighting the darkness requires wisdom, not just strength. Here's something that absolutely fascinates me about this connection. Turgon served in a way under the guidance of Ulmo, the Vala of Waters, one of the most mysterious and far-seeing of the Vala. Ulmo was the one who showed Turgon where to build Gondolin, who warned him through dreams and visions, who never abandoned the elves, even when other Vala seemed distant. Gandalf served Manwë, the elder king of the Vala, lord of the winds and skies. These are two different Vala, but both working toward the same ultimate goal: the defeat of evil in Arda. When Gandalf carries Glamdring, he's literally carrying a weapon that represents Ulmo's long game against Morgoth into a new age where he's playing Minot as long game against Sauron. The layers just keep building when you think about what that sword represents. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes how the Noldor, who came to Middle-earth, were the most skilled craftsmen among the elves, and the smiths of Gondolin were exceptional even among them. Glamdring wasn't forged in just any workshop. It was made in Gondolin during the height of its power. It's probably in the same forges that created Orcrist and the other legendary weapons of that city. The blade would have been created with all the skill and craft magic that the Noldor possessed, imbued with their hatred of evil and their determination to stand against Morgoth. Every time Gandalf draws that sword, he's not just pulling out a piece of metal. He's unleashing a weapon that was specifically designed to fight the darkness of the First Age. And you know what really gets me? Turgon carried this sword knowing that he was continuing a fight his father Fingolfin had waged. Fingolfin, who, in one of the most incredible passages in all of Tolkien's works, rode alone to the gates of Angband and challenged Morgoth himself to single combat. Morgoth, the fallen Valar, was actually afraid to come out at first, afraid of an elf. When they finally fought, Fingolfin wounded Morgoth 7 times before falling. Turgon would have known this story intimately. He would have carried Glamdring with the memory of his father's courage burning in his heart. So when Gandalf later faces the Balrog in Moria, he's carrying a sword that has already been part of the long struggle against the same evil, just in a different form. Think about the poetry of it too, though Tolkien never makes it explicit. Turgon eventually died defending Gondolin when it fell, betrayed and besieged, standing in his tower as the city burned around him. He fought to the very end, and Glamdring would have been in his hand, or at least with him during those final moments. The sword survived when its master didn't. It was presumably taken as plunder when Gondolin fell, lost to history, passing through who knows how many hands over thousands of years, till it ended up in a troll horde in the Troll Shores, from the hand of a king to the cave of a monster. But then Gandalf finds it, and suddenly Glamdring is back in the hands of someone worthy. Someone fighting the same war Turgon fought, just in a different age. Now, here's where things get really interesting when you dig into the timeline. Glamdring was forged in Gondolin, which existed during the First Age of Middle-earth. The city fell around the year 510 of the First Age. The Hobbit takes place in the year 2941 of the Third Age. But you can't just add those numbers together because there was an entire Second Age in between that lasted 3,441 years. So we're talking about a weapon that survived roughly 6,500 years of Middle-earth's history. Think about what that means. This sword was already ancient when Numenor was just being founded. It was old when Sauron first forged the One Ring. It predates every single kingdom of men that we know about in the Third Age. The fact that it ended up in a troll is actually pretty significant when you think about it. Trolls aren't just random monsters in Tolkien's world. They're corrupted creatures made by Morgoth in mockery of Ents, and they serve the darkness. These particular trolls that Gandalf, Thorin, and Bilbo encounter had clearly been raiding and collecting treasure for a long time. Where did they get these swords? The text doesn't say explicitly, but we know from the Silmarillion that when Gondolin fell, it was sacked by Morgoth's forces, orcs, Balrogs, and dragons. The treasures of that great city would have been scattered, taken as plunder, fought over, lost, and found again countless times over the millennia. What absolutely blows my mind is that Glamdring wasn't alone. Orcrist was in that same horde, and we're told these swords were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They were paired weapons. In a sense, both forged to fight the same enemies. When the goblins in the Misty Mountains see these blades later in The Hobbit, they immediately recognize them. They call Glamdring Beater and Orcrist Biter, and they're absolutely terrified. These aren't just ancient weapons. They're famous ancient weapons. The goblin folk have been passing down the memory of these specific swords for over 6,000 years. That's how much devastation they caused, how many orcs and goblins fell to these blades, that the memory survived across millennia. Tolkien specifically mentions in the text that the goblins and orcs of the Misty Mountains recognized these swords on sight. Stop and think about what that means. We're not talking about goblins who fought in the original Goblin Wars of Beleriand. Those are long dead. We're talking about their descendants, many generations removed, who have somehow maintained the oral history or cultural memory of these particular weapons. It's like if someone today was shown a specific sword from ancient Samaria and could immediately identify it by name. That's the level of legendary status we're dealing with. These swords didn't just kill orcs. They became symbols of terror that echoed through the generations. Here's what I love about how Tolkien writes this. When Elrond identifies the swords in Rivendell, he does it so matter-of-factly. He just tells them the history. These were made in Gondolin. This one was the king's sword, or famous in the old songs. He doesn't make a huge dramatic deal out of it, because for Elrond, this isn't ancient history in quite the same way it is for everyone else. Elrond was born in the First Age. He actually lived through that time period. He never saw Gondolin because it had already fallen before his birth, but he knew people who had been there. His own great-grandfather was Turgon. When he holds Glamdring and tells Gandalf its history, he's talking about his own family's sword. That connection between Elrond and Turgon is something that deserves way more attention than it usually gets. Turgon's daughter was Idril Celebrimbor, who married Tuor, one of the only men ever to marry into elven royalty. Their son was Eärendil, the famous mariner who sailed to Valinor and became a star. Eärendil married Elwing, and they had 2 sons, Elrond and Elrond. So, Turgon is literally Elrond's great-grandfather on his father's side. When the company of Thorin Oakenshield arrives at Rivendell and Gandalf is carrying Glamdring, Elrond is looking at his great-grandfather's sword. the sword his ancestor carried when he ruled the most beautiful city in Balrog. Imagine that moment from Elrond's perspective for a second. He's thousands of years old. He's seen kingdoms rise and fall. He's carrying one of the 3 elven rings. He's basically seen everything. But then Gandalf shows up carrying Glamdring, and suddenly he's confronted with this tangible piece of his family history, a weapon his great-grandfather wielded in the wars against Morgoth. Tolkien doesn't write Elrond as particularly emotional about it. He's too ancient and wise for that kind of display. But you have to imagine there's something profound happening in that recognition. His family line has been crucial to the fight against evil in every age, and here's proof of that continuity, carried by someone continuing that same fight. What makes this even more meaningful is understanding who Turgon was in Elrond's family legacy. This wasn't just any ancestor. Turgon was a king who stood firm against impossible odds, who built something beautiful and lasting even as the world burned, who ultimately gave his life defending what he loved. Those are the same qualities we see in Elrond throughout The Lord of the Rings. He maintains Rivendell as a haven of peace and beauty, even with darkness growing. He's been fighting Sauron for thousands of years. He holds the line. When you realize he's doing exactly what his great-grandfather did, just in a different age, with different circumstances, it adds this incredible weight to his character. And then there's Gandalf standing there with that sword, probably not even knowing initially whose weapon he'd claimed, just picked it up because it was a good blade and he needed one. But once Elrond tells him the history, Gandalf would have understood immediately what he was carrying. He would have known about Turgon from his time in Valinor before coming to Middle-earth. The Maya knew the history of the wars against Morgoth. They were there, in a sense, watching it unfold, and some Maya even participated directly in those wars. So Gandalf would have known exactly how significant this blade was, would have understood that he was now carrying a weapon that represented one of the greatest stands against evil in the history of the world. There's something beautifully appropriate about a Maya carrying an elven king's sword. Both Gandalf and Turgon were beings who chose to limit their power for a greater purpose. Gandalf was restricted by the Valar from revealing his true nature or matching Sauron's strength directly. He had to work subtly through guidance and inspiration. Turgon, while not limited in the same way, chose concealment over confrontation. He could have marched his armies out of Gondolin at any time to join the wars raging across Beleriand. He had the strength to make a real difference on the battlefield, but he followed Ulmo's counsel and stayed hidden, building and preserving, waiting for the right moment that, tragically, never quite came the way he hoped. Both of them understood something crucial about fighting evil that a lot of people miss. It's not always about the big dramatic battle or the show of force. Sometimes it's about patience, about playing the long game, about creating something good and beautiful and strong that can endure even when everything else is falling apart. Gondolin stood for centuries as proof that the darkness hadn't won, that beauty and craft and civilization could still exist. Gandalf spent thousands of years in Middle-earth doing basically the same thing. Maintaining hope, inspiring resistance, preserving knowledge, never letting the darkness completely take over, even in the worst times. When Gandalf faces the Balrog in Moria, he's got Glamdring in his hand, and I don't think Tolkien chose that detail randomly. That confrontation on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm is one of the most iconic moments in all of The Lord of the Rings. And understanding what Glamdring represents makes it even more powerful. Balrogs were mire corrupted by Morgoth, turned into demons of flame and shadow. They were some of Morgoth's most terrifying servants in the First Age, and Gondolin, Turgon city, was brought down partly by Balrogs. When Gondolin fell, Balrogs were there in the assault, burning and destroying. The Silmarillion describes the fall of Gondolin in devastating detail. Dragons and Balrogs breaking through the defenses, the city burning, the desperate last stands. Glorfindel, one of Gondolin's greatest warriors, killed a Balrog during the retreat, but died doing it, falling from a mountaintop locked in combat with the demon. Turgon died in his tower, the king's tower, as it fell around him. The whole city was obliterated, its people scattered or killed, its treasures lost. The Balrogs were instruments of that destruction. They were there when Glamdring city fell, when its king died. So, when Gandalf stands on that bridge in Moria, staring down a Balrog with Glamdring in his hand, that sword is facing its ancient enemy again. This is the same kind of creature that destroyed Gondolin, that killed Turgon's people, that ended the last great kingdom of the Noldor in Beleriand. And Glamdring is back, after 6,500 years, getting another chance to strike against the darkness. Gandalf even says, "You cannot pass," which has become such an iconic line. But think about what he's actually doing in that moment. He's standing alone against a demon of the ancient world, wielding the sword of a king who stood against such demons in the First Age. The poetry of it is just incredible. Turgon never got his moment of ultimate victory. Gondolin fell, he died, and the sword was lost. But Glamdring survived, found its way into Gandalf's hands, and got to be part of a victory that Turgon never saw. Gandalf defeats the Balrog, takes him down into darkness with it. Yes, and he dies doing it, but he wins. The Balrog is destroyed. After all those millennia, a weapon forged in Gondolin finally gets its revenge for what happened to that city. Glamdring strikes down one of the very type of creatures that destroyed its home, and then there's what happens after. Gandalf doesn't just die and stay dead like Turgon did, sent back, upgraded to Gandalf the White, given greater power and authority to finish the job. Turgon fought to the end and fell with his city, noble but ultimately unsuccessful in the larger war. Gandalf fights to the end, falls with the Balrog, and is resurrected to continue the fight. He gets what Turgon never got, a second chance, a renewal, a return. When he comes back, I've always wondered if he still had Glamdring. The text isn't completely clear on this, but it would be fitting if he did. If that sword continued with him through death and return, there's this parallel with Glorfindel too that's worth talking about. Glorfindel was one of the heroes of Gondolin who died killing a Balrog during the city's fall. He was later re-embodied in Valinor and eventually sent back to Middle-earth, returning in the Second Age to continue fighting evil. So here you have Glorfindel, who died fighting a Balrog and came back, and Gandalf, who died fighting a Balrog and came back. Glorfindel would have fought alongside Turgon, probably saw Glamdring and Orcharist in action during the Goblin Wars of Beleriand. When Gandalf shows up in Rivendell with Glamdring, Glorfindel would have recognized it instantly. God. In fact, Glorfindel is at Rivendell during the events of The Lord of the Rings. He's the one who gives, God, Frodo his horse to escape the Nazgul, who helps defend the ford of Bruinen. When the Council of Elrond happens, Glorfindel is there. Imagine that scene from his perspective. He's sitting in that council with Gandalf, who's carrying the sword that Glorfindel last saw in Gondolin over 6,000 years ago. Sword from his home city, from the king he served, in the hands of a Maya who just did exactly what Glorfindel did, died killing a Balrog and came back. The connections just keep layering deeper the more you think about it. Tolkien had this amazing ability to create depth through these kinds of connections without ever being heavy-handed about it. He doesn't stop the story to explain all of this. You have to piece it yourself from different books, different references, different parts of the legendarium. Glamdring is just presented as a good sword that Gandalf carries. And only if you dig into the Silmarillion and understand the history of Gondolin do you realize what it actually represents. It's this incredible reward for readers who engage deeply with the material, who care enough to trace the connections across thousands of years of fictional history. Let me take you back to something that really hammers home how long this sword has been around. The Silmarillion tells us that the years of the trees, before the First Age even began, lasted for ages uncounted, and then the First Age itself ran for about 590 years. Then came the entire Second Age, 3,441 years long, during which Numenor rose and fell. Sauron forged the One Ring, and the last alliance was formed. Then the Third Age, during which The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings take place, runs for another 3,021 years. Glamdring was forged early in the First Age and survives all the way to being carried by Gandalf in the late Third Age. That means this sword existed before the sun and moon first rose in the sky, because they were created during the First Age. After Morgoth destroyed the two trees, Glamdring is literally older than the current order of the world. It was forged in a time when the only light came from the stars and the Silmarils, and the greatest enemy wasn't Sauron, but his master Morgoth. When the geography of Middle-earth was completely different because Beleriand hadn't sunk into the sea yet. Try to wrap your head around that kind of age. Every single kingdom we see in The Lord of the Rings, Gondor, Rohan, the Shire, everything, all of it came into existence long after this sword was made. And through all that time, through all those ages and all those changes, the sword survived. Survived the War of Wrath that ended the First Age, which literally reshaped the continent and sank most of Beleriand under the ocean. It survived the entire Second Age, somehow staying intact while kingdoms rose and fell. It survived into the Third Age and ended up in a troll horde, where 3 trolls, who couldn't even speak proper English, were using it as plunder. From the hand of the king of Gondolin to a cave in the troll shores. That's both tragic and kind of darkly funny when you think about it. But then Gandalf finds it, and suddenly Glamdring's story intersects with the narrative of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It's no longer a lost relic. It's an active participant in the War of the Ring. Every time Gandalf draws that blade, he's bringing 6,000 years of history into the present moment. When he strikes down orcs in Moria, when he faces the Balrog, when he rides to war at Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith in the books, Glamdring is there. A weapon forged to fight Morgoth is now fighting Morgoth's servant Sauron. The war hasn't ended, it's just continued across the ages with new players and new battles. There's something deeply moving about the idea of objects carrying history forward like this. We get so focused on the characters, on Frodo and Sam and Aragorn and everyone else, that we sometimes forget the objects have stories too. The One Ring has an obvious story that's central to the plot, but weapons like Glamdring and Orcrist and Andorel also have these deep histories. They're not just tools, they're witnesses to history. Connections between ages, physical proof that the struggle against darkness has been going on since before anyone can remember and will continue as long as evil exists in the world. Tolkien understood this in a way that most fantasy writers don't. He didn't just give Gandalf a magic sword, he gave him a specific magic sword, with a specific history tied to specific people and specific events. You can read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings without knowing any of this, and the story works fine. But when you do know it, when you understand that Glamdring was Turgon's sword, that Turgon was Elrond's great-grandfather, that Gondolin fell to Balrogs, that the sword is over 6,000 years old, suddenly these little details that seemed like flavor text become profound connections that tie the entire legendarium together. And you know what's really beautiful about this? Tolkien never finished the story of Middle-earth. He kept writing and revising and expanding until he died. And then his son Christopher spent decades editing and publishing all the additional material. The Silmarillion wasn't published until after Tolkien's death. Unfinished tales came later. The History of Middle-earth series took decades to complete. All these connections and depths were there in Tolkien's mind and notes, but readers had to piece them together gradually over the years. It's like the history of Glamdring itself, fragments surviving through time, waiting to be discovered and understood by those who care enough to look. When I read about Gandalf using Glamdring, I think about all of this. I think about Turgon wielding it in Gondolin, about the sword surviving the fall of that great city, about it lying forgotten for millennia, about Gandalf finding it almost by accident, about Elrond recognizing his ancestor's weapon, about Glorfindel seeing it again after so long, about it facing a Balrog in Moria. Every single swing of that blade in the story carries all of that weight with it. That's the kind of depth that makes Tolkien's work so endlessly rewarding to explore. There's also something to be said about how the sword passes from king to wizard, from open rule to hidden guidance. Turgon was a king. He ruled a city, commanded armies, made laws, sat on a throne. His power was public and official. Gandalf is the complete opposite. He wanders around in ragged gray robes, claims to be just a wandering wizard, never tells anyone he's actually a Maya, works entirely through suggestion and influence rather than command. He has no kingdom, no throne, no official authority, but in his own way, he's doing exactly what Turgon did, standing against the darkness, protecting the good, fighting a war that seems unwinnable. The fact that Glamdring serves both of these approaches to fighting evil says something important about the nature of that fight. There's a time for kings and kingdoms, for armies and open warfare, for making a stand and saying, here we draw the line. That was Turgon's time. But there's also a time for subtlety, for working in the shadows, for inspiring others rather than commanding them, for strategic patience rather than direct confrontation. That was Gandalf's time, at least until he became Gandalf the White. The same sword serves both approaches because ultimately they're both part of the same long struggle. Tolkien fought in World War I, saw the horrors of the Somme, lost most of his close friends to that war. He knew what real warfare looked like, understood the cost of standing against evil when he wrote about Gondolin falling despite Turgon's best efforts. About heroic last stands that end in defeat, about weapons surviving their wielders, he was drawing on something real. Not direct allegory, he hated allegory, but the emotional truth of what it means to fight for something good in a world where evil is powerful and victory is never guaranteed. Glamdring surviving Gondolin's fall is like hope surviving disaster. It's a reminder that even when we lose, even when everything falls apart, something endures to carry on the fight. And isn't that exactly what we see in The Lord of the Rings? The Fellowship breaks, Gandalf falls, Boromir dies. Everything seems to be going wrong, but the quest continues. Different people take up different parts of the burden. The fight goes on. Just like Glamdring, continuing to serve even after Turgon fell, even after Gondolin burned, even after 6,000 years of the sword being lost and forgotten, comes back when it's needed. It finds its way into the right hands. The war against evil doesn't end just because we lose battles or even entire ages. It keeps going as long as someone is willing to pick up the sword and stand. I think that's why the detail about Glamdring matters so much, even though Tolkien doesn't make a big deal out of it in the text. It's this quiet affirmation that the fight is worth it, that resistance matters, that standing against the darkness has value, even if you personally don't live to see the victory. Turgon died in Gondolin's fall, but his sword helped defeat the Balrog of Moria and played a role in the War of the Ring. His stand in the First Age mattered because it was part of a continuum of resistance that eventually, thousands of years later, led to Sauron's defeat. Every act of defiance against evil, no matter how long ago, contributes to the eventual victory. So when you see Gandalf drawing Glamdring in your mind as you read, remember,